In this video, I'm going to break down exactly how I help scale a marketing agency from $80,000 to $150,000 per month as their only full-time closer. And I'm going to break down exactly what changed once sales was delegated over to me from the founder full-time, how we kept revenue stable when call volume was very, very low, and generally how sales impacted revenue and profit within the agency on a month-to-month basis. The way the business looked when I joined was we're an e-com marketing agency. We work with e-commerce brands and we mostly do Google ads and we also do some Meta ads as well. And we're doing about $80,000 per month. And the founder was taking all the sales calls himself and closing at about 40%, which is great. But the sales infrastructure itself was pretty minimal. There was a pitch deck, which the founder was using in the calls, but there was no real call structure, scripts, defined processes, etc. It was basically just a call funnel from Meta ads, booking calls into the calendar, founder was taking them, closing the deals, and that's pretty much it. Nothing else really was happening around that. There was nothing wrong with that, but the business just couldn't absorb more volume on the sales side because the founder was splitting his time across sales and marketing and ops and basically just trying to do many different things at once, which is normal when you're in a marketing agency in the beginning, right? But as I'm sure you understand, over time, you need to delegate roles, and it was time to delegate sales for him. And the reason why this was capping his growth is because he was personally handling multiple functions within the agency, and sales was working, but it was competing directly for, attention with every other area of the business. Obviously, every hour, every minute spent on sales was time that he couldn't spend on other areas, and sales wasn't his focus, wasn't where he wanted to be spending his time and energy. He wanted to be marketing, he wanted to be doing operations, and yeah, it just made so much more sense to stop distracting himself with sales, get someone in place, and then focus on those other areas of the business. Because the second that the inbound funnel that he'd built started, booking consistent calls and his calendar was full, he became the bottleneck, right? His capacity was. It was no longer lead flow or close rate, calls were getting booked, they were getting closed. So now it's right, we need more capacity. In 2024, in December, I joined the team and it was fully delegated over to me. I took full ownership of everything to do with sales, the calendar, so sales calls, the pipeline in general, all sales conversations and, cash collection, just as a whole. And the founder stepped away from the sales role entirely in terms of day-to-day doing sales to focus on marketing and ops and just generally running the business in other areas. And he only stayed involved in sales at an oversight level, and we just spoke daily, so he had visibility on revenue and call quality to inform his marketing decisions, so he knew what was going on with the ads. And the second, or not the second, but very, very quickly, after sales having a full-time owner, once I'd stepped in and it had been fully delegated over to me, we were booking calls in the calendar with Meta ads, so there was no inherited warm pipeline. I joined on the 17th of December, 2024. Closed a couple deals the week I joined, but then it was very, very quiet over Christmas. And then the second we got to January, so 2 weeks after I joined, that month, I took 60 calls, live calls, closed 24 of those, so about almost exactly 40% close rate, I think it is exactly, collected $70,000 of cash, and our total agency revenue jumped from the average kind of 80, I think maybe even 90 or 100K where we were before, to 150K, and we had a personal best month in terms of revenue. Now, this was a massive, massive jump for the agency, and obviously it was all kind of unlocked by the fact that now somebody could do sales full time instead of being, having their attention divided across multiple different roles, multiple different, functions within the business. The founder was already closing at 40% before I joined, so it's not like, he just needed a better closer. It's not like he sucked at sales. And it's if we could just get somebody closing these deals, which I can't close, then things would work much, much better. What he needed was, somebody in that full-time seat instead of sales being squeezed between other priorities. And once sales had someone's full attention, my own attention, the results reflected that immediately, right? It's close rate stayed much the same, but sales volume as a whole increased massively. Sales volume is just the number of calls booked in the calendar and the close rate. And his close rate was good, my close rate was good, but he could only have so many calls in the calendar, I could have loads. And also I could do all the follow-ups and chasing people and emails and tracking it all that needed to be done as well to make those deals turn into a reality, because that's, taking the sales calls exclusively is only one part of the job. There's being on the calls, there's following up with people, there's reactivating old leads, there's chasing people who didn't show up to the call or who cancelled and stuff like that, and basically nurturing those people and turning them into opportunities. And if you don't do that, you'll only close so many of the sales calls where you speak to people one time, and you'll lose out on all these opportunities that you would have got from follow-up or, just generally chasing people. Now, my role and what any closer's role should look like inside an agency is taking calls on a regular basis. So that's around this time, around January, I was taking 3 to 4 calls a day, 5 days per week. So taking like 15 to 20 calls a week, something like that. Or that's about how many bookings I was having in my calendar. Obviously, you got no-shows and cancellations and stuff. And then outside of calls, all the time really that I was spending on the sales side was following up with people, like I said, reactivating old leads. This kind of came later, once we'd had like historic leads inside the CRM, reactivating those people. I remember in January last year, what I was doing was chasing all the people who maybe didn't convert when I spoke to them before Christmas. They weren't ready to make a decision yet. So just reactivating those people. And then also identifying areas of opportunity and expansion within the existing client base we had, which I'm going to speak to you about very, very shortly. And my rule really was just to chase anybody who hadn't said no. And that should be the rule of any good closer, right? If you've got a closer and you've got leads inside a CRM who have not said no, then we need to get them to either a no, and then we can stop chasing them, or turn them into a client, right? That's the ideal scenario. So yeah, front-end closing really is only part of the job. And, when call volume dropped, it was time for me to book calls into my own calendar. I'm going to talk a little bit more about how that happened over the year, because I worked in the agency for pretty much exactly 12 months, almost to a day. At the start, call volume was really, really high, and then slowly things tapered off. And that's when I had to employ some different strategies, which I'm going to share with you later in this video, that really helps maintain the revenue and profit of the agency. If anything, it helped it grow. And yeah, there was times where, there were points where it was like, we've got all these clients, we're delivering, the main service, Google or Meta ads. How can we expand? How can we make more money per client? And that's when upsells became something that we really wanted to focus on. And we began to upsell clients different services, expand within the same niche. So instead of, selling Google ads to e-commerce brands and then doing it to like local lead gen, doing it as like a local lead gen service for, HVAC or whatever kind of typical agency niche, we thought we'll offer different services, but within the same niche for e-commerce. And we slowly but surely added more services, and then also started to pursue upselling our existing clients into those services within kind of 30 to 60 days of onboarding. Now, like I said, revenue was really good in January, but then it tapered off because call volume tapered off as well. And if you're running a cold traffic funnel, you'll know that call volume is, a fickle kind of thing. You can't book calls all year consistently unless you really know what you're doing. And most people who are scaling an agency and in this kind of beginner stage where they're making kind of upper 5 figures, low 6 figures per month, they're still just kind of figuring things out with the marketing and kind of cracking the code with that. And eventually, we went from having, 3, 4, maybe even 5 calls booked in the calendar every single day to 1 or 2 calls booked per day maximum, sometimes 0 calls. And what we had to do in these kind of times, and what I kind of made myself do, was go into 2 different types of modes. There was defensive mode and there was offensive mode. Defensive mode was when the calendar was full. And basically, I was just trying to get the most out of every single sales call and squeeze in any additional sales actions around that. But the primary focus was converting the people who booked into the calendar as, the most recently, because we're spending all this money on ads. We want to collect cash on that. We want to be able to scale the ads. We want to validate that the ads are working. So the objective exclusively is close deals from these ads, and then squeeze anything else like upsells or, reactivation of the pipeline, old leads in around that. The times when the calendar was light though, because call volume was so inconsistent, sometimes it was super, super busy and sometimes it was quite quiet. We want to go offensive, right? Calendar's light, barely any people in there, but I still want to make money. The business still needs to make money. How can we do that? That's when it's like reactivating the pipeline, reaching out to old leads, reaching out to people who didn't say yes, didn't say no, maybe never got back to us, pushing for those upsells with our existing clients, identifying upsell opportunities, figuring out which services would be a best fit, booking calls with those clients, checking in with the fulfillment team and seeing how the things were going with the client to see if it's even an appropriate time to upsell them, and just generally creating those opportunities. And then what the back end ended up looking like over this time was in the early months, December to February, 80 to 90% of the revenue was new cash coming in from consistent calls being booked inside the funnel. And the business was pretty much entirely dependent on closing new deals. We did have recurring revenue in place, but, loads of the new cash, a significant percentage of our monthly revenue began to kind of spawn from those new deals. And what eventually kind of changed was we added email marketing into the mix kind of month 2, month 3 of 2025, so like around February, March time. We also added Meta and Creatives as a possible service to upsell people. Sorry, creatives for Meta as a possible service to upsell clients to later on inside the year as well. And then also we added CRO in June and July. And then we just built this dashboard where it was like, cool, here's every client we've got right now. Here's every service, here's every service we could possibly offer them, and then whether or not they are currently on that service, whether they have somebody else doing that service for them, whether or not we've even offered them, the other service, and we basically identify exactly which service was best in terms of being, beneficial for them to upsell them next, and then work on converting that person and either getting them to a yes or a no. If it was a yes, great, we upsell them, and then, periodically try and upsell them the next thing if they need it. Or if it was a no worries, then we'd work on selling them something else at a later point later down the line as well. And the result was, we got to July, and we were kind of struggling on the recurring cash side a little bit. I think we're at like, the numbers that I have here are my own personal numbers because I don't have the back end data for the business anymore. But I was making money from recurring commission, and I was making money from upfront cash collected. July, we were at 37k recurring, so not very good, but we were collecting like 60, 70k of new cash a lot of the time, making we were making over 100k a month the whole year, basically. And then August, we got up to 45k of recurring, and then by September, we got up to 70k of recurring and also 60k of new cash. And that was just attributed for me in September, so that was 130k of revenue purely attributed to myself. And then there was also just general like legacy revenue on the back end that, the founder had closed previously, clients that had been, long established inside the agency, a handful of those clients. But for the majority of the revenue that was being made for the agency, especially when we got to September, which I think was our record month, like 150 or maybe 160k a month, that's when we hit it again, or finally broke that January kind of pop off. 130 of the 160 was coming directly from myself, the closer. 50% of the clients were on 2 or more services, and that recurring base just meant that we had much more stability as far as like revenue consistency. I think that was also our most profitable month. We made like $60,000 or $70,000 profit, which is great. And yeah, everything was going well. And this had all come as a result of being extremely driven in and proactive in, not just getting the most out of those initial kind of calls, from in the calendar that were coming from the ads, but also being proactive in chasing people in the pipeline and reactivating old people, and also being proactive in thinking, how can we make more money per client? And this was something that the founder had, like, that was his idea. And then it was just something that I executed on. And eventually, like, we started to have more ideas together about exactly how we would go about expanding the revenue and expanding the LTV and the average monthly retainer from all the clients. And yeah, and that just resulted in significant growth. So it's like we hit like 150 in January. I think we dipped down to like 120 in Feb. We had like this kind of valley of despair, and then we came like where we never dropped below 100, but it just kind of felt bad. And then we hit that pop off month in September and like 160k of revenue, and everything was fantastic. And yeah, that was all just a result of those actions. Now, we did try and hire at a few different points, but there were multiple mistakes made throughout this process, which are kind of clear to see now in hindsight. So if you think about from the perspective of the founder, he hired me, brought me onto the team. I crushed it. And then he's thinking, awesome, let's just hire somebody else who's going to crush it as well. And that was logical. It's like, if we can get this one guy doing 100k a month, like pretty quick, maybe we can get somebody else doing 100k a month, somebody else, and then all of a sudden we've scaled to like 300, 400, 500k a month. It was just, the revenue would then just be a function of how many closers we can get on the team. But unfortunately, that was not how things went. The first person we hired was the wrong fit, and they had a business to consumer background, a B2C background. This was a very, very strong kind of B2B offer. We were working with very sophisticated business owners, and that just wasn't a good fit. They were a good closer, probably, but it just was not a good fit. And they only lasted for like 4 or 5 weeks, barely closed any deals. Like I said, I was the only full-time closer, but we did try and make it work with other closers throughout this process. And you'll soon see kind of what that brought us to, like conclusion-wise. Hire number 2, better fit, good person, good closer. But unfortunately, they just joined in a period of low call volume, and they never really found that like momentum that comes from having consistent sales calls in your calendar. And I think it was like off and on, and then they had to go on holiday and whatever, and it just never worked. They only closed like 4 or 5 deals throughout the entire period, something like that, maybe even less. I think I've actually got the numbers wrong for like the total number of deals closed, because I know that every other closer who joined in the business over the time that I worked there, basically didn't put any numbers on the board, which is completely fine. And you'll soon understand why, like what the issue was. It's not down to the closer. It's never a closer issue. It's always a business issue, because we should have hired the right people. That's bottom line. Like, the responsibility lies on the team, on us. And at the time, the founder was mostly involved in the sales process, but so was I. But we didn't really have a rigorous way of onboarding and ramping up sales reps that was going to be consistent, which I now understand how to do. And yeah, the third hire, we just got unlucky. She left within 30 days to pursue her own business. It is what it is. And it was just, our process was just too basic. We had 2 interviews, one with the founder, just him, and then one with me and the founder. There was no real kind of rigid onboarding process that we had in place until the last closer we hired, but then they left quite early. They actually did start to close some deals as well, which is a shame, but it is what it is. And there was no real way of validating how competent they were going to be specifically on this offer rather than just general competence. So yeah, I think, in total, maybe they closed 10 deals, maybe 15 at a 20% close rate between them. Whereas like the 12 months I was in the agency, I think it was like 150 or 170 or 180 deals at like a 35 to 45% close rate. So it was a significant difference. And yeah, they were just missing that deep offer and niche knowledge, which, we needed to be able to teach them. That was the kind of responsibility that lied on us, being able to transfer that knowledge, because I learned the offer really quickly and then relied on the fact that I was knowledgeable in the offer itself to close the deals. But also they were lacking some of the proactivity to improve without being pushed. I think some people can be quite reactive in the way that they learn. They wait to be told that they've made a mistake, whereas some people kind of actively pursue making those mistakes and then, try and avoid making them and chase, feedback and that kind of thing. And I think more of that from those people would have been better. And I was very heavy on that. And if you hire a closer, you want them to be really heavy on that. But yeah, and that is kind of like a hiring issue in many ways. You want to make sure that you're finding the right people in that way. But it can be quite hard to do that. And yeah, I think the thing that we realized in the end was just one rep could add 200K a month without needing, like, we could get to 200K a month without needing 2 closers. So, given that we weren't at 200K a month already, there was no urgency to hire another person until I was fully maxed out. So it's like, logically speaking, instead of just trying to like stack reps who are doing like 100K a month each, just get one person to 200K a month and then add another person, because, better to have fewer people doing more than the other way around, right? It's just higher leverage, generally speaking. And I think that, what all of this proves is that revenue stability, like keeping the agency afloat when the call volume dipped down, when there were times where, barely any calls were getting booked into the calendar and things were really tricky, full ownership of the sales role, where not only was I able to close the upfront, like the sales calls, but also squeeze revenue out of our database and out of our existing client base. That is what protected the agency in those downturns. And that is something the founder could never do, or any founder can do reliably without sacrificing other areas of the business, because it required a lot of work, a lot of time investment to do all that cold calling people, reactivating people, emailing people, looking into the call recording notes to, remember where people were up to before sending them a personalized email. All of that just came from like pure ownership of the sales role, and that can only be achieved having a full-time closer. Like, that's what you need. And you need that full-time closer also to be dedicated to making this happen, to be offensive, to go on to be aggressive and to go on the offensive, when there are those downtimes, instead of just kind of rolling over and saying, hey, like, this sucks, there's low call volume. And growth really started to compound, and things really started to scale, like particularly on the recurring revenue side, once sales was fully owned by one person, and also monetizing the back end was super intentional. And the hires didn't fail because they were bad people. They failed because nothing was really built to set them up properly to a main extent. I think there's a good chance the hires would have at least been way more successful if they just had a better system to step into. But I think me and the founder both kind of took for granted the fact that I had come in and done a great job without those systems, and we assumed that anybody else could do that, but it turned out not to be true. And yeah, this is the transition that most agency founders who are taking all the sales calls are looking to make, right? It's taking themselves out the sales seat, having someone come in and close deals reliably, and then them being able to focus on the areas of the business that only them can do. And you can't keep the sales founder owned, right? Being purely, founder centric without capping the growth of the business. Because even if they go full time on sales and go crazy on it, even if you're like closing deals all day long, then you're not focusing on other areas that do require attention, like I said, that only you can do. Now, what I do now, now I'm free from being a sales rep is I help founders find sales talent, and I build the systems that don't need an A player to work, but reward them if you do find, one of those kind of golden people that you want on your team. One of those Jordan Belfort-esque closers. So yeah, if you're looking for my help with any of this, you can book a call with me, and I'll be more than happy to help you. The link's in the description, or you can book a call if you're already on the page already, and I will see you next time.